And we are losing this national treasure, turning it into a wasteland. Now, we're subsidizing this with tens of millions of taxpayer dollars every year. Now, does anyone know how we subsidize the logging in the Tongass National Forest?
Road building?
Road building. We build the roads for the timber companies, even though there are more than 5,000 miles of roads already in the forest, almost all of them in need of repair. We continue to build roads, even though that is devastating the vast majority of the jobs in this region. And this was in 2001. Since then, there's been a major change that came out in a study that has vastly increased the number of tourism and fishing jobs and decreased the number of timber jobs to now about 680. And a recent Forest Service study found that there are 38 times more jobs in Southeast Alaska in tourism and fishing than there are in logging. 38 times. And there's 31 times more revenue coming into the region from tourism and from fishing than coming from the logging industry. And even if we stopped logging in the old growth forest, there will still be selective cut logging in areas trying to restore some of the old growth forest, still retaining, if not increasing, the timber jobs, such that many of the environmentalists in the region are beginning to work with loggers. Loggers realize that we will keep their jobs, and we'll actually increase them, but they'll be gone if we do the clear cutting. If we do select cutting on private lands and on areas that have already been cut, there'll be more logging jobs, and these alliances are very powerful. But even though the vast majority of jobs are in the tourism and fishing industry, the vast amount of the subsidies, about $40 million a year, is in timber and road building. And the road building is for the timber industry. And this is something that we now have a new administration. We need to vastly change this picture, increasing the funds for tourism and fishing and decreasing for timber. We could pay every single logger in Southeast Alaska $110,000 a year to sit home and do nothing, and we'd still save money and we would save our forests. A wiser choice would be to hire people to restore the old logging roads that are eroding and slipping and destroying the forests. And that would improve the fishing and tourism jobs. Now, for my journey to the Tongass, and after I went to the Tongass, I went up into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and into the Arctic Ocean. So this was 2 expeditions in one trip. I took the train, as I do for most of my speaking tours, and for most of the travel, even though it's not very easy in our country with Amtrak. So I took Amtrak first over to California from my Ohio home, and did a speaking tour of California, went all the way back to my high school reunion in Ohio, went up through Buffalo, New York, and Toronto, and caught the Via Rail, incredibly scenic railway, all the way across the Canadian, the Shield, and then the Plains, and then the Rockies here in Jasper National Park. And the trains get about 10 times better fuel efficiency per passenger mile, and they're a wonderful way to see the country. And unfortunately, just downstream from this area of the Athabasca River is the most horrific and the most damaging environmentally damaging project in the world. That's the tar sands. They are strip mining a region the size of Florida and turning the tar into oil using vast amounts of energy, a devastating project that's just downstream from this area as I'm going across Canada. And then from Jasper, I took the train all the way to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, where I caught the ferry for 70 miles up to Ketchikan. Now, Ketchikan is an area where they've had logging, and the pulp mill recently closed. And when I arrived at this, I came at the same time as the Greenpeace boat Arctic Sunrise. Now, the village of Ketchikan would not allow the Greenpeace boat to dock. Even though many of the people in the community were very in favor of Greenpeace, they would not give the boat a dock. They held a public meeting in town more than 100 people came out, almost all of them in support of Greenpeace and opposing the logging. A year prior, in the village of Craig, a drunk logger threw a chair at Greenpeace and got arrested. And there was still some of that hostility. After the meeting, a bunch of loggers came up to me and grabbed one of the sandals off of my backpack, and which would prove to be a very damaging blow beyond the $5 or $10 sandal that was taken, as I'll mention later. Now, I had done some work with Greenpeace. I'd been a delegate for Greenpeace at The Hague for the UN Conference on Climate Change in 2000. And so I asked if I could go on the boat, and I really wanted to see the place by helicopter. And because the group, because I worked for Greenpeace, they invited me onto the boat. I went on with a dinghy, and because they wouldn't allow them to dock, I had to go on a Zodiac over to the boat and got onto the Arctic Sunrise boat, which then went around the Prince of Wales Island. This is one of the most heavily logged islands in the Tongass, but there are still some critical areas of old growth that need protected. There is now a lawsuit being filed by a large number of environmental groups, including the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, that is trying to stop a major logging project on the Prince of Wales Island, a project area of about 50,000 acres, 29 miles, more than 3,000 acres scheduled to be clear-cut. And that lawsuit was just filed this month. A lawsuit was won a couple months ago that stopped another major logging project of about 75 million board feet over about 70 million acres. So some great work being done by the Sierra Club in protecting this forest. And on the Arctic Sunrise boat, we really got a first-hand view of the horrific clear-cutting that is going on all throughout the region. And they took me up in the helicopter that they have right on the deck of the boat. And from the helicopter, you really get a bird's eye view of the destruction being shown by the forest. From the helicopter, the pilot would often go 100 miles an hour, just about 10 feet above the ground in water. And we had the doors of the helicopter were off, and so we looked right out onto the landscape. It was just the pilot and myself and a BBC photographer, Martha Dixon from London, who were on the helicopter. And they always leave one seat free in case they find someone that's stranded and in need of being rescued, which happens a lot. And it is the logging roads that is the cause of the destruction. Everywhere the logging roads go, the clear cuts go around it. And yet, there's still some areas that need to be protected, the vast majority of it that are protecting salmon streams in the area. And another of the big problems with logging is logging combined with climate change are making many of the streams in the region too warm for salmon. And the salmon eggs are not growing up. And it's a combination of both the logging and climate change. And of course, logging causes climate change. The deforestation causes about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. And the temperate rainforest has some of the highest amounts of carbon of any forest in the world. So it is particularly important to protect this forest. And again, you can really see how the logging roads, which we are subsidizing with our taxpayer dollars, are causing the logging. That's Martha Dixon with the BBC in front of me. The logging roads, which cost about $250,000 per mile, are a massive devastation to the forest because they cause erosion and, of course, the clear cutting that comes. And then you get the slippage because they are not maintained. Almost all of the logging roads are not maintained. Meanwhile, we're building more than 1,000 miles more roads. So we get all of the slippage that occurs, and with that, the erosion and other damages. And this shows, and it's been similar, about 40 million a year in subsidies. And I was hoping for a quick change with Obama, but we really haven't seen it yet.